morning. Welcome, everyone. Also afternoon if you're not on the West Coast as well. Let's be fair. And yeah, so we are going to start what's next for DevOps. I'm so happy to see at this point 200 of us sitting in a room. We're slowly coming through, and I'm super excited to get questions from you as well. But yeah, so we're going to be talking about DevOps. DevOps is a term in the past decade. It's been around, and the goal is around delivering quality software at a great velocity too as well. And I personally have seen the term DevOps kind of be fluid as far as what things sort of get attributed to it and what things don't get attributed to it. So I'm happy to have the conversation with our great panelist today and sort of shepherd the conversation. But first, I'll introduce myself. I am Brian Douglas, staff developer advocate here at GitHub. And I am I wouldn't say I'm a DevOps noob. I've been using DevOps probably since I've started starting engineering, but probably did not realize it until very recently that it was all called DevOps. So I'm gonna go around, we'll introduce each other. Actually, let's introduce ourselves rather than each other. And let's go around the horn and explain what DevOps means to you. And I think we'll start with our first panelist, Maya.
Thank you. Yeah, so I'm Maya Katrowski. I work at GitHub. I'm a product manager in software supply chain security. And for me, DevOps is really about sharing responsibility for events between different roles. So part of it, it's obviously traditionally between developers and operations and making everybody responsible for an outage. But I also think from a security point of view, just kind of how like DevSecOps is about making developers as well as the security team jointly responsible for vulnerabilities or for security issues.
Excellent, thanks Maya. And let's go next with Sasha, our next panelist.
Hey, Brian. So I'm Sasha Rosamo. I'm a team lead at Red Hat on a managed OpenShift black belt team. This is what happens when you have too many words in your title. I've been involved in DevOps Days, the conference that started the whole term DevOps, since 2014. And we kind of have been arguing about the term ever since then, and actually before that, right? And we still haven't come to a single conclusion. I think there are two primary parts that people mention when they talk about DevOps, right? One is about sort of automating everything, and the other is about collaboration, working towards the common goal. And so while I do believe in automating everything, especially about automating everything that's toil, I do think that collaboration is more important. So kind of bringing all the teams, not just Dev and Ops, right? All the teams in the organization to kind of work together towards the common goal.
Excellent. Thanks for that, Sasha. And yeah, nice shout out to DevOps Days, folks, if you aren't already following that conference series. And then next, Ben, why don't you introduce yourself and tell us what DevOps means to you?
Sure, thanks. I'm Ben Sigelman. I'm one of the co-founders and the CEO at Lightstep. We had a big launch today, so my like one-liner for Lightstep actually had to change. It's a big enough launch to change our one-liner. We are an observability platform that's the easiest way for DevOps and SREs to both measure the health and assess changes in their systems. In terms of what DevOps means to me, I couldn't agree more with what Sasha said about it having so many definitions. It's kind of hilarious to try to add another to the pile. But so maybe I'll pivot and say, like, what problem does DevOps solve? I think the number one obstacle to progress in any kind of engineering effort is I love human beings, but you don't want a human being having to depend on another human being in order to get their work done. And the point of DevOps is to try and find a role with enough scope that individual people can operate and develop software in an unimpeded way. And so what we're really trying to do in my mind is to reduce unnecessary blocking communication between people. That I think is the problem we're trying to solve with DevOps.
Excellent. And then finally, Stephen, do you want to introduce yourself as well?
Sure. Yeah. So I'm Stephen O'Grady. I'm the co-founder of RedMonk. RedMonk, if you haven't heard of us, is a developer-focused industry analyst firm. And so we spend a lot of our time with developers, and as for consequence of that, we have had who knows how many conversations right on DevOps. As the other panelists have said, I think the definitions will vary. I think the important bit to me is that it is, we talk a lot about the sort of some of the underlying component technologies, that go into, sort of a quote unquote DevOps stack. To me, it's largely about the people, right? As somebody who grew up in a world where I developed things and I kicked them over the wall to ops and things went wrong, too bad, that's your problem, ops. That was, let's just say, maybe not the best way to do things. And, I think, one of the things we've seen in DevOps is those two sort of organizations, those two teams, come together, right? And the incentives and the drivers for that have been varied. It depends on shop, it depends on, circumstances and so on. But at the end of the day, what we're talking about are two previously distinct groups that now, really have to work, sort of more collaboratively, than they have in the past.
Excellent. Appreciate that context too, as well. And it's like, as I mentioned, I haven't worked specifically focused on DevOps in my career, but I've been using it since the beginning of my career, which is ironic, but also I want to really shift gears from what it means to us and like find out more about the changes that we've seen as, I guess, professionals and experts in the space. So specifically around the changes around collaborations and sort of getting stuff to build faster as well. So actually, Sasha, let's start with you. And what sort of changes have you seen? And then also, just one question: what changes are here to stay?
Yeah. So first of all, I think it's really interesting to kind of watch this industry mature over time and watch the terms mature over time. So like in the very beginning, so the term continuous delivery actually came out around the time that the term DevOps came out, right? And back in the day, people just didn't believe it was possible. We used to talk to people and folks would be like, well, maybe Netflix and Google can release code every day, but no sane company could ever attempt to release more than like once in 6 months and stuff like that, right? And so there was a lot of gradual conversation about automating things, and like you don't have to click buttons, or you can check your scripts into source control, and like your life will be better if you automate repeatable error-prone things, right? And then like companies came out with like infrastructure as code tools, which also made things better, but also were kind of a big innovation that people had to get on board with and stuff like that. And so as we grow, I see more and more pieces of this becoming part of the life cycle. So like we matured to site reliability engineering, we matured to shifting security left, making security part of the life cycle, and all of these things. So it's like kind of getting more automation into the pieces of the workflow.
Yeah, excellent. You bring up a great point too as well. And I was just, before getting on this call, was merging into Pentabot PRs to improve my my dependencies and everything like that. And actually, Maya, did you have? I know you work with that team as well. Do you have any context to?
Yeah, no, I think to add on to what Sasha was saying around, automation and tooling there, I think that makes a ton of sense, right? Like I think one of the things that I don't want to see go away with the move to DevOps is more consistency in tooling, right? Automate what you can, but just the idea that even you have a consistent build pipeline and you have a consistent deployment pipeline, like that sounds like that was crazy for some companies 10 years ago, right? Everybody built locally, deployed locally, did their thing, and like now, like people are chat opsing, watching their babysitting their rollouts, and they can get information like live in Slack as to how the rollout's going. Like it's a very different experience for the average developer than before, and I think that's not going to go away. And from a security point of view, like something like Pentabot, obviously, like just automating that as well, like making that something that you react to rather than something you have to go start yourself.
Yeah, and what's been interesting too as well is specifically in the last year, we've all seen teams who had we still have offices, some of us still do, and we have leases, and we were working in person. And what we mentioned, Stephen, throwing stuff over the wall, like there were actually legitimate walls, but now we're all remote. So we've seen a lot of differences in sort of how we interact and collaborate, and like having Slack and Teams is a great tool to collaborate and have consistency across the team and know what's going on. But I'm curious to hear more of your thoughts on the past year and seeing sort of DevOps react to everybody being working from home, but also what are you excited about for the next coming year in 2021?
I think from my perspective, the biggest thing I think we're looking at, right now, we're having, sort of conversations about this in a sort of a variety of spaces is, if we go back to those two teams, right, and those teams are backed by lots and lots of different technologies, right? So the market has essentially said, whatever the, sort of problem, there is a product, a service, typically multiple products or services to solve that, right? And, that's been the approach the market has taken to date, right? Which is, we have one tool for, one thing, one tool for another one, and so on and so on. And, typically the developers, or in some cases their employers, are left with a job of, taking, these half dozen, 2 dozen different pieces and trying to make them all work together, right? And the net of that is that it's a fragmented and sort of really suboptimal developer experience. So, what we're looking for sort of in the year ahead is how can we make this simpler? How can we make, sort of those handoffs cleaner? How can we make the integrations tighter? And, ultimately deliver, the quality of developer experience, that is necessary, both for the developers to move more quickly and safely, and frankly, just have a better overall experience, but also, to let the businesses they work for, do what they want to do, right? Which at this point, sort of in 2021 is move as quickly as they can.
Yeah, indeed. I think the velocity is like real key for leveraging things like DevOps and getting folks back to what they want to do, which is ship code, like get stuff out there, releasing, like get back to or achieve the greatness of Netflix as the one company that everybody points to for doing stuff great. But moving along, actually, before we move along, I just want to mention, folks, we are here for an hour, 45 minutes at this point. And if you do have questions, please ask questions. We do have a panelist of experts who can answer questions today. So yeah, this is your time. You signed up for this, and you're taking time out of your chat ops and watching this as well. So now moving on, DevOps is it bridges the gap between dev and ops. And I love the fact that those two words are combined into one word because it's a combination of what we do as developers, but also understanding the operations as well. But I'm curious, Ben, for you, congratulations on the launch today. But I'm curious to find out more about what is observability, and so how that applies to DevOps.
Yeah, sure. Thanks. So, I mean, I guess in terms of the first part of the question around bringing dev and ops closer together, I said it earlier, I guess, in my, maybe not the definition of DevOps, but what problem it's solving. The problem we're trying to solve is to reduce the need for humans to block on each other when they're trying to get their work done. First, we did it just by saying, look, there's dev and ops. And then the other part of it, I think, was splitting things, splitting code into smaller pieces that we call services and deploying them in parallel. So wonderful. So the idea is that we have each small two-pizza DevOps team building, operating their service in perfect independence. Everything's automated, CI/CD is on, it's great. Unfortunately, that is a myth. I mean, the problem is that the independence is completely contradicted by the fact that the application in production is totally codependent. The services on a per transaction basis are depending on each other all the time. So if you push something out in your CI/CD pipeline and your service is fine with that, your service and not anyone else's service is fine with that change, like mission accomplished. But it turns out that even if your service is still healthy, something else might not be. Like you could change your behavior by 100x in that release, and something downstream from you could be suffering as a result. I think anyone who's operated an actual production application at scale and uses Kafka, I'm not trying to pick on Kafka here, it's like the ultimate shared resource, but you'll see Kafka, it's on fire, and it's not because any one person's doing anything wrong, but there's just too many of them, and then it's like this massive outage. Same thing with databases, et cetera, et cetera. So getting back to the question for observability, I think the purpose of observability is, it's not metrics, logs, and traces, that's BS. The point of observability is to take changes, either planned changes with CI/CD or unplanned changes with incident response, and to explain those. They typically will involve multiple teams, and so anything we can do, back to automation, to automate the process and guide people from their own team to another is a really valuable service to the practice of DevOps. And so these teams are independent until they're not. The not is often in production. Observability is what can help with that.
Excellent. Yeah, you had me at two pizza teams, which folks, if you haven't heard that term, meaning that you could feed a team with, actually, is it, you could feed a team with two pizzas, or is it two teams with one pizza?
It depends on the pizza.
You don't want a team that's bigger than you can feed with two pizzas. It's an Amazon thing from like a decade ago.
Yeah. All right.
But yeah, if you prefer low carb, I think you can do like 2 paleo bowls or whatever.
Yeah, I'm not much of a sharer. I've got a small family, but I tend to have my own pizza. But moving on, I'm curious about the idea of getting production and operations to make development better, like in the terms of velocity or vice versa. Steven, do you have any context you can provide on sort of your operations and production environments?
Yeah, I think a lot of it comes down to, to Ben's point, right? In other words, these teams are, frequently independent until they're not, right? And, so naturally, one of the solutions for that is sort of better communications, better integrations between those teams. And, a lot of that comes down to, to sort of use a, sort of a, I don't know, I guess a holistic word, if you will. It comes down to, really the empathy, between those teams, right? So, Zappos, sort of the shoe company, sort of famously had this process when they would onboard anybody, executives or whomever, they started them in the customer service department because they wanted everybody, regardless of role, to understand A, that was important, and B, what that job was like. And, if there's one thing DevOps has, certainly done, I think over the past couple of years is, really educated both sides on the challenges of the other. Right, in the sense that, like I said, back in my day, it was, ops was a totally different world. I didn't have any exposure to it. And now, in a world where, developers are doing a lot of ops type tasks, you have a lot more sort of empathy. You realize that, man, this is actually really hard, sort of, and vice versa. So I think in terms, the best thing that teams can do is understand that, they are, going to be sort of working in and operating in an integrated world. And therefore, they really need to communicate. And that all comes down, back to, like I said, the ability to empathize with one another.
Yeah, I love that statement about empathy too as well. And I think you sort of explained what I was trying to explain earlier about me being a developer that never paid attention to DevOps. I think what I was trying to say is I never paid attention to ops specifically.
Right.
And now I do see, as me merging dependent bot PRs before going live on this stream, that I'm deeply ingrained, and I understand the value of having dependencies automated and being able to open those or close those PRs, or merge them rather, not just close them. But yeah, actually, Ben, going back to the observability question, I wanted to find out more context around this term observability, because I understand the term monitoring and being able to sort of identify things and signals and speeds and stuff like that within your production environment. But how is that different than observability?
Yeah, great question. I get this one a lot. I mean, there's definitely a meme out there that observability is just a new word for monitoring. I really don't agree with that. There's also a meme out there that observability is going to replace monitoring. I even more don't agree with that. Monitoring is really, really important. Monitoring is supposed to be, anyway, it's the process of deciding that something is important to you and your business, and you can see it in a single part of your system, and you're going to, well, monitor it, right? So you're going to create alerts around that potentially. You might have a dashboard with a number of things that are critical. And in my mind, the business purpose of monitoring is to connect some part of your system to the business through intentional, deliberate monitoring. Okay, fine. Now, as I was saying earlier, the reason we do that is because sometimes those things aren't healthy, either because someone else made a change, or you made a change, or one of your cloud dependencies had a change. When those changes occur, I think that the problem people have to solve is much harder, which is to understand, and it's not going to be like a one-click wonder thing where you just have the answer appear to you on screen. You're going to have to do some work, but you need tooling to help guide you through that process. Because the unfortunate reality is that these systems are so big. You have, many of Lightstep's customers deploy software literally 10,000 times a month within their architecture. Sorting through that type of change is really, really overwhelming, especially when you throw customer behavior changes onto the pile. And observability tools can help you understand those changes. So monitoring is about measuring health. Observability is about understanding changes to that health, whether they be planned or unplanned.
And I want to jump in and sort of throw a sentence in there that I think I've heard it described as, if monitoring is reactive, then observability is proactive, right? What did we learn? What can we implement even without getting alerted and getting an incident, to sort of observe from the system and then learn from it, being proactive about it?
I think that's a really good point. I would also say that there's this idea of software being correct or incorrect, or being secure or insecure. And there certainly are things that you can discover in CI or in DevSecOps, dependency checks and things like that. But a lot of software behavior is totally heuristic and depends on the workload. And unfortunately, you can't really predict how something's going to work these days until you deploy it into production. And observability is your tool for doing that. Monitoring's not going to get you there. And when people try to apply monitoring to that problem, you end up with like 10,000 dashboards to your company, and everyone's kind of upset about it. It's also really expensive. So observability can help solve that problem. If you feel like you have too many dashboards, you're probably using monitoring to do observability, and that's not very effective.
I will say that it is deterministic. Software is insecure. Like that's not something we need to question.
No,
And all code is technical debt. So this is great.
Excellent. Yes, glass half empty at this point. Yeah, but
I
I
think it's much more than half empty. It's more like 99% empty probably, but there's still some water in there somewhere.
Somehow we still make the world a better place with software. Somehow it's still working.
Yeah, it's a different paradigm, which is like something that I guess folks, if you signed up for this and you're here listening to the conversation, reminder you could ask questions. We'll definitely field some of those at the end. But like for DevOps, I find that the point, I found the point to be the independence of the two ecosystems, but also having those two parallels also cross against basically exist over teams too as well. So I'm trying to understand like what is the point of DevOps, I guess, when you live in this sort of paradox of like independence versus it's everybody's job at this point. How can teams still be independent and understand like when you have these dashboards or whether or not you're doing observability, how do we know like whose job it is basically? And Maya or Sasha, do you want to grab that? Yeah.
Yeah, I think it's a difference about responsibility versus like what your job. Sorry, maybe that's job responsibilities versus accountability. Maybe is the right word here I'm trying to use.
Okay.
So if your service goes down, ideally you do a blameless postmortem, but the person who pushed the code is just as guilty as the person who wasn't monitoring the service or the person who runs the infrastructure, right? Like there's shared accountability for the fact that that went down. If you get hacked or if you have a vulnerability that gets exploited, it's the same thing. The person who wrote the line of code or didn't patch the dependency or didn't update the firewall rules or whatever it happens to be are equally accountable. And so I think it's less about people still have roles, people still have specializations and things that they do better, right? And that they're truly responsible for in a job sense. But everyone is accountable for pointing out, hey, why is that thing not working as it should be? Or like, why aren't we doing as much as we could be doing in that particular space?
And I think, when we first started talking about DevOps, right? And the reason DevOps word is Dev and Ops together, right? There was a lot of kind of notion that speed and reliability or speed and quality don't go together. And so developers want to move fast and then operations want to keep everything reliable. So change is a bad thing. And those people could never agree, right? They're incentivized on opposite directions. So they could never agree on things to do. And the problem with that is like, what is all of our value, right? We're delivering software to customers, useful software that is accomplishing goals for customers. And that means that like all of us are working towards the common goal, right? Developers, operations, security, everybody. And so we needed to kind of recognize that and get more familiar with that idea and kind of have the language for breaking the silos. And then the other thing I want to come back to Stephen's point from earlier when he said that, being in customer service creates empathy. And that's 100% true, right? I worked in IT where it was, mostly technical support, and, it definitely creates empathy for other things, right? And there's this conversation that comes up every now and again about like, should we put developers on call? And there's like the opinion of like, oh, developers are too expensive. Why should we waste their time on call? It's like, I think this is a huge mental shift, right? Once you experience that end customer problem, you understand that it's not just like I wrote my code and I'm all happy with it and that's ops problem now, right? You experience the other part of it and gain empathy to it.
Yeah, that word empathy keeps coming up quite a bit.
Yeah, I will just say, sort of speaking as a developer who was on call. Yeah, I vote no. No, it was just awful. I'd be at a bar way downtown in New York City. I get paged. And you never know sort of what being on call is like until you're trying to find a payphone, either Bleecker Street bar at like 1 a.m, trying to dial in. It's just awful. So yeah, no, but to Sasha's point, I think from an empathy standpoint, at that point you understand, okay, here's what's going on, right? This is what this means, and it's not, I can't just work my sort of 9 to 5 shift, kick some stuff over the wall, and I'm going to basically say good luck with that, right? Which is for better or for worse what I used to do.
But Steve, also, like, I want to add up to it. And I was also on call when I wasn't officially on call, right? And then you like find yourself on a Saturday on a second margarita and someone's like, your code is broken, come back in, right? And it's like, that's to the point of like PagerDuty stuff, right? When no one is on call, everyone's on call all the time, right? And that's also the situation you don't want to be in.
Yeah, that's exactly right.
I can see you and raise you on that, Sasha. As a 20% project when I was at Google, when I was working on super nerdy stuff, my family had no idea what I was working on. So I decided to build Google Weather as a 20% project. Fine, whatever. So if you search for weather San Francisco, you'll see the little forecast. So I did that as a 20% project. It was great. I was really happy about it. And then it turned out I had a date parsing issue that was only going to be revealed in the new year. And everything at Google is running on Pacific time. And I was living in New York at the time, and so at 3 a.m. on January 1st, when I, suffice to say, was not in a position to be writing code, got paged that the whole darn thing was totally off. And I wrote as a 20% project. No one had any idea what was going on. I've got a lot of empathy for people who have to deal with something like that. It's a little nightmare. But I also want to say, go ahead.
Go ahead. No, go ahead.
Also, date parsing is evil. I just want to say that.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, the lesson here is never, ever use local time for anything, ever, except just playing something to a user. That was not a good idea. Anyway, I was also going to say, on a slightly more serious note, that about the topic you asked about, Brian, about parallelism and independence and so on, I would go back to what Maya said about observability being proactive. Or sorry, was that Sasha? Sasha, okay, sorry, my bad. Good point, although apparently my brain isn't working well today. So I think that's a big part of it too. No one wants to break someone else's service. And right now, I think even with observability, a lot of times it is reactive, where you find out your service breaks and then you're trying to optimize for MPTI, mean time to innocence, and figure out who to pass this thing off to. It doesn't need to be that way. I think since we're on a GitHub thing, if you're in GitHub and you're doing a deploy in CI/CD, I think we're to the point now where you can have that happen all within a single platform. It really should be the case that if that deployment is negatively affecting some other person's service level objective, if their SLO is starting to flag because of your release, you should know about that. And observability can help to close that loop. But so you're still dependent on each other. It's not like you can get rid of that. I mean, it's fundamental, but at least you can let people know. I think no one wants to do a release and wake up their colleagues, right? You're both going to end up being woken up at that point, right? But we need to kind of close that loop, I think, automatically across service boundaries, not just within a single DevOps team's work.
Yeah, and Ben, real quick before we move on, can you explain SLO? Because you dropped the acronym, and I don't think I can explain it myself.
Sure. Service level objective, it's just a fancy way of saying the actual goals that your service has from a reliability standpoint as seen by your service's clients. So if your service is like a credit card checkout service, there's probably only a few things that your clients actually care about. You need to say, what is your actual goal? I'm going to be faster than 1 second 99% of the time. I'm going to have this many errors. And the idea is that you always have some errors, as it's not realistic to have a perfect service, nor is it even really helpful because then you can't make changes. But you should know what your budget is for errors. There's a great book that Alex Hidalgo wrote, an O'Reilly book about SLOs that was published a few months ago that goes into excruciating detail about every aspect of how to implement them. So I recommend that if somebody wants to learn more about it.
Excellent. And speaking of books, Stephen, you wrote a book about kingmakers. And actually, the new kingmakers is the title. And I wanted to actually shift gears and talk about DevOps culture and sort of how you had mentioned, actually, now I'm forgetting who said it, but basically developers and deploying on Friday and that their time's too expensive. I think it might have been Sasha that said that. But also, keep me honest, Sasha, if that wasn't you. But basically, I want to find out about the culture of DevOps and specifically the direction of companies to basically institute keeping that culture intact and making sure that operations is paid attention to just as much as developers are?
Yeah, so it's been interesting to watch over the past, sort of few years, right? So, basically the book was an outgrowth of conversations we were having over and over where, at the top of companies, leadership was just sort of fundamentally unaware of the importance of the developer staff, right? So it was funny, I kept having developers come up to me and, they'd read the book and say, hey, this is great, but, I kind of knew this, like, hey, there's some new facts and figures. And my reply always was, look, it's not for you, right? You know this, like, I'm not going to tell you anything you don't know. This is for your boss, right? Who doesn't know sort of, how things are important and so on. Anyhow, so the book came out a number of years ago. And, I think one of the interesting things that's happened is that companies have really started to get this and really started to internalize this. And, to the point where, you see companies doing, really bending over backwards, right, to try to make developers happy, whether that's the environment they work in, salary, compensation, sort of all of that, right? So, they are exhibiting all the signs that you would hope that, okay, hey, this is, one of, if not the most important constituency within my organization, right? And what's happened with DevOps is that, as those, the boundaries between developers and operations have broken down, operations have begun to, get pulled into that fold, right? People are understanding, for example, cost of downtime, right? You just run a couple numbers, and depending on sort of what your business is, the impact of sort of being down, for in some cases any length of time, can be, enormously damaging, and if it's a bad outage, it can be catastrophic. So, what we've ended up seeing, like I said, is, as these groups have sort of blended, operations is, to some degree become the new kingmakers as well, because they look at this and they're like, hey, this is what happens. This is what it means to the business if we're down. So why don't we, why don't you empower me to make sure that doesn't happen, or at least make sure it doesn't happen, with any degree of frequency.
Excellent. I love that context too as well, around the book actually being attributed, like pointed towards the boss too as well. Sometimes me as a developer myself, I could be very developer centric in the way I react and interact with questions and problems. But there are other folks who touch code and are interacting with the team. But moving on, I'm curious, Sasha, maybe you can answer this question. What's the biggest improvement for a DevOps engineer in the quality of life that you've seen in the last year?
So first I'm going to pick a bone with the DevOps engineer title and tell you a story, right? So when we first started like the DevOps Days conferences, we were really opinionated that people shouldn't call themselves DevOps engineer, because if we are about breaking silos between Dev and Ops, then what does it help us to create another silo that's called DevOps team? And now it's DevOps team's problem, right? And so it kind of goes against the whole idea. However, I have a friend who wouldn't take a job of director of DevOps until they changed the title, because he was like, no, I no. Anyway, but then Paul Reed started doing this thing called the Pay Talk, and we would collect sort of anonymous salary data from folks at these conferences, basically salary, level of experience, and title. And we noticed that people got paid like on average $20,000 more when they were called DevOps engineers as opposed to ops or sysadmin or something like that. And so we just said, okay, like go get paid more, like call yourself whatever you want, right? It helps your career. By the way, I think the new hot term is SRE. So now like you see a lot of teams renaming themselves to SRE. It's funny because they don't change anything about what they do, but they just like, oh, now I'm an SRE now. So that kind of works. To come back to the actual question, I think I see a lot of improvement in terms of like people used to work with actual checklists, right? And people used to keep things like not in source control and copy them over. And like this was all very error prone, and you were very, very likely to get paged. And like there would be one person who's in knowledge for like, the SME for everything, and everybody else would just have to like sort of watch and learn constantly, and that person couldn't go on vacation. Like a lot of that used to happen all the time, and it still happens in a lot of companies, but I see a lot of companies actually being really close to continuous delivery and being able to automate all the toil and sort of focus on, making improvements and delivering value rather than just keeping the lights on.
I want to add on to that, and also a bit of what Stephen was saying around developers being the kingmakers. Companies are realizing that blocking developers in any way is negative for the company overall, right? And so developers set the pace, and anything that you do that will slow down developers is bad. So if that means, having to have an approval from a separate team like SRE or security, no, that's bad, right? And so as much of that functionality that you can roll into the kind of traditional developer thing, part of traditional developer-centric tools, that's, I think, the biggest change that I've seen to like the standard developers' quality of life, and that a lot of that stuff is just kind of done for them, done automatically, as much as possible, right? Obviously to different degrees in different companies.
Yeah, thank you for that context too, and thanks for your answer too as well, Sasha. I just changed my LinkedIn to staff developer advocate, comma SRE. We'll see what happens. I'll report back. But moving on, I'm curious actually on the subject. How has DevOps changed hiring and retention at companies now that this is part of the culture for developers and for these companies in general to get folks to not be blocked by some of the, I guess, quote unquote, tedious things. These things are important, but they could seem to be tedious for folks who are trying to ship code. What have you seen, actually, Maya, on that subject? How have you seen especially like even in your neck of the woods and security as well?
I think it's more of a cultural change than anything else, right? It's not like going and looking like, do you familiar with, this SaaS tool and this SCA tool, and do you know how to do all these things? It's more just like, hey, have you worked with the developer team before? Do you only do security reviews, or can you also respond to incidents? But I think in the security realm also, like, to be fair, especially at a smaller company, people are asked to do so many different things, just kind of like how someone in ops has to do so many different things, right? You can't realistically do AppSec reviews and run InfoSec and manage the CA for the company, and like there's only so much you can do. So they're just, I think in general, hiring is more focused on someone who's willing to learn new skills and new tools, works well with others, and then retention becomes much more critical because like once you do get someone who's good at that stuff, you don't want to lose them, right? The developer, the security person, the ops lead is the kingmaker.
Excellent. I was going to ask Ben, do you have any context around that, like from the pedestal you sit at leading a company?
I'm looking for my pedestal. I don't see it. No, I think what mine says is right on target. I would say on the DevSecOps thing, I have to admit I have a little bit of a problem with the term. With DevOps, I think that the roles and responsibilities of Dev and Ops truly can be fused into one person who can take on 99% or whatever of the work. Maybe it's just because I don't really, frankly, understand security, but like to me, there's a bunch of stuff in security that seems way out there. Like you need to like really know a whole bunch about something that is actually not that related to deploying software. And so it's like, because it's not as all encompassing, I've always had some like, I feel like security needs to be part of DevOps, but the DevSecOps thing, well,
we agree. No. I think I actually really don't like the term DevSecOps, and I think the term to me makes a lot more sense, and I've heard pitched better is continuous security. Just like you have continuous, continuous development, you have continuous security. You're checking security at multiple steps along the pipeline. To what you're saying, like, yeah, you absolutely still need like someone who knows InfoSec, and that you're not going to replace them with a developer and some automated tools. But the kind of application security review you might be doing as part of a release can be to some large extent automated. And and then you can focus your AppSec engineers' time on what really matters. So you have a release that's touching some part of your tool that is cryptography. You want someone to go look at that and kind of triple check it, right? But you don't want someone to like go look at the button change in the UI and like worry about it. Like take the automated tool and kind of save that person's time. So I think that's more what it is. Now I don't know why it's like to the point. I'm like, it's not DevSecOps. I could call it like Dev QA Ops, and I could call it like Dev Privacy Ops, and like everything else can also be in the middle. So like you should be doing all of these things all of the time. I think for whatever reason, for some nice marketing reason, DevSecOps has certainly gained popularity as a term.
So I think, and I want to jump in here. And first of all, on the DevSecOps, so I was recently on a panel that was about DevSecOps, and I think most what people agreed on was that it was a way to give people the language to talk about things right? And that is valuable. Like DevOps in itself was just a way to, like Brian said, a lot of people were doing DevOps before and not knowing that this was called DevOps, right? But it's valuable to give you a term to describe a thing. And that's why I think DevSecOps is, as ridiculous as it may be, is still valuable. But the other thing is, like, I am picking up on with saying that security is sort of once removed from the developer lifecycle. Like I spent most of my time as a developer, right? And then as I started learning more about security, I was completely surprised at how little I knew about security, how little I focused on making my code secure, how little I knew. And like you said, everyone wants to build good applications. No developer wants to push broken code and expose their company to security vulnerabilities, but we don't teach people and we don't make it easy for them, right? And so I think security has to come into the part of the life cycle. It has to be planned for it. It can't be just this one blocker at the end that approves your release. It has to be in your Jira tickets, right? And planned for it and automated, right? Dependabot is excellent, right? You couldn't do what Dependabot does by just manually going through your dependencies and trying to identify everything in the tree, right? You would go crazy. So we can make it as easy as we can. That doesn't mean you don't need an InfoSec person, or you don't need someone to look at the right side of your life cycle or monitor the security issues and stuff like that. But I do believe that we want to bring it and make it as easy and bring as far left as we can, if you will.
Yeah, and the sort of far left point I think is important, because the term itself, I could take it or leave it. I think if I remember right, I think it's actually the product of another analyst firm, so I think I'm contractually obligated to dislike it. But regardless of sort of the term itself, I think the opportunity to push security into the teams, I think is important. Because way back when we, I was part of a team that built a online health record system. And I knew nothing about security. I raised the point a couple times to this client we're working for. I was like, do you have people who are like looking at this? Because medical records seem like one of those things you might want to secure. And their response was like, no, we'll do that when it's delivered. I was like, that doesn't make a ton of sense to me. Like maybe have somebody check it on the way before we're actually done. So anyway, so the whole notion, whatever we call it, the whole notion that we shift some of these activities, into the development process itself, theoretically to catch things earlier, whether those are automated scans, for known vulnerabilities, or whether that's an InfoSec professional, the more that they can be embedded in the team itself, the better, in my experience.
Excellent. And so we've been racing through these questions, and we answered a bit of the DevOps ones. So we want to make some time for Q&A, but before we jump in there, Ben, could you just finish off the answer of the retention piece of the DevOps question?
Oh, sure. I like the DevSecOps conversation more, but yeah, I mean, I think that let's talk about retention specifically, and also, I don't know, just training and efficacy. If you go to the CNCF landscape, I mean, you can Google it if you want, it's sort of dizzying buffet menu of tools and technologies you probably don't know about. But they're all related to DevOps genuinely. And so I think if you go to your teams and say, hey, like we're doing DevOps, everyone go there and pick the thing that you like the most, it's just a guaranteed disaster. Whereas if, to harp on Netflix, they have this paid path approach where you decide these are the tools and technologies that we're using for our organization. They may or may not seem the best to you, but these are the ones that you can actually expect to be supported. And then train your team on that. Obviously, the training itself can be a lot more streamlined, and I think people are more productive and happier too. And I have seen, but genuinely, it seems obvious, but I still see organizations letting every team make their own decisions about tooling, and that does not end well for all sorts of reasons, including retention. So I would maybe throw that on there. My last comment, I guess, would just be that, like Home Depot, I think famously has this program where they take, highly motivated, self-starting people off the showroom floor within the actual Home Depot stores, and they give them a training program to become productive DevOps engineers. It's called the Orange Method, and this program actually works. I think they have like a 90-something% completion rate of like getting into the role. And I think to me it's to show that this stuff isn't really actually that hard to teach if you can get someone who has almost no programming experience to being productive, as long as the tools and technologies are well trained and I think well scoped. And I think that's what they've done, which is in my mind kind of a model for how we can get more people doing this stuff. And and improve our delivery in the process.
Not to derail this conversation, but you said like, the landscape and all the tools and everything. One of my biggest frustrations is people adopting new tools when they don't know why they're adopting new tools. I see Steven nodding his head. You probably get a lot of those questions, but like one of my, it's like, they're like, I want to use this thing. I'm like, okay, why? And then if you can't explain why, then maybe you shouldn't be using that thing. And then, you can do something else. It's
resume-driven development, right? Everyone's doing Kubernetes because Kubernetes is a really valuable skill to put on your LinkedIn. Yay!
Once
not
upon
that
a time,
Kubernetes is bad. Kubernetes is great, especially OpenShift.
Yeah, once upon a time, back when portals were a thing, we went into a client and we're supposed to implement a portal, and it turned out they'd already bought one and forgotten about it, and they went out and had a bake off for an entirely new product. So to Maya's point, yeah, people buy all kinds of stuff. Sometimes they even use it. A lot of times they don't. So yeah, it's always an interesting world out there. Anyway,
yeah.
To derail us. Back to you, Brian.
I would say my garage is full of stuff that I bought for some reason and am not using it. I have got tons of fishing poles as well if anybody wants to buy those from me. But moving on, I've got some questions from the Q&A as well. So I'm going to read these off and kind of up for grabs from anybody. I think this has been a great conversation, so I'm interested to hear these answers. So Deloitte mentions no ops in a serverless world among the 2019 tech trends. So declaring that that the next state in the evolution of cloud computing automates key tasks, allowing IT talent to shift focus from operations and outcomes. How far do you think we are from that? And is that what's next? No ops.
I'll jump in with a hot take. I love the hot takes. I think the biggest one for me is like no ops works for like no code. I'm not talking about like low code. I'm talking about like literally no code. Like you're still gonna have outages and still gonna have security issues. I think
throw serverless in there,
trend. Sorry.
Throw serverless in there as well.
Yeah, yeah. I think we are seeing a trend of like you need to manage less. So something like serverless, you need to manage less. But like or like recommendations on machine sizes, right? That's actual, auto scaling up and down. Like those are actual things that help ops people. That doesn't mean that you have no ops. You still have ops.
Yeah, I would agree with that, and I would agree that. So I think no ops kind of came from the serverless world, and I don't think it works, right? Because you still have ops. You're just doing different things, but you still have tasks that are defined by a certain team, and like you can rename them to something else. Doesn't mean they go away.
Yeah, to me that'll be a lot like NoSQL, where so all you had the whole category of databases that came out and defined themselves by not having a query language. And then they figured out after a little bit that having a query language is actually pretty handy. So they all went back and invented their own query languages. So NoSQL is now actually probably more accurate to describe as lots of SQL. And I think that's right. I mean, you're not going to have no ops. You'll have different kinds of ops, in different settings. So I'm not really not a huge fan of that term. Put it that way.
Yeah. I mean, just to pile on, we were joking around. We saw some press release from, it doesn't matter who, that's not the point, talking about 0 MTTR. So the idea of like your mean time to resolution is 0 after you buy such and such technology, and which I think is sort of hilarious. And feels very similar to this. We were joking around about having not a number MTTR because you're dividing by 0. You have no incidents, like then we have nan MTTR, not 0 MTTR. But this is the same thing. It's like, I guess maybe as you're saying for a no code situation, maybe, but this is the thing, and this is really a rant about serverless, but I'll be brief. Like, it is never the case that you can scale something without, like, let's just say a cache, like the most obvious basic thing. And there's just a world of difference between having a cache locally that survives between requests and having a cache you have to access by doing a system call, sending a network packet to some other VM somewhere else and getting the response back and parsing it. I mean, it's just not realistic to have services that are truly 100% stateless. And the second you introduce any state, including just that like little basic cache, you have the opportunity for all types of breakages, and then it just goes from there. But the old joke about computer science is just naming and cache invalidation. It's totally true. And like,
off by 1 error. I want to jump in and say, like, stateless app is probably my biggest pet peeve, because truly stateless application by definition does nothing.
Yes, thank you.
So unless you want to do a static website, which is fine, right? If your application accomplishes anything, it cannot be stateless, right? It's just where you keep the state and how you handle it.
I think there is a merit to what I think the notion of the question was asking, or what the Deloitte or whoever was saying, which is like, we are headed to a world where this matters less, in the sense that like a lot more of the stuff is automated, a lot more, there are a few people who are experts, and you don't need everyone to understand all of it in the same level of detail. I think that was one of the things, and like I worked on Kubernetes for a while, so I can take a bash at it a little bit. Like, one of the things I never understood about Kubernetes, it's like, why are there fanboys? This is a layer that you're not supposed to care about. And in 10 years, you're not going to. So why the hell are you learning it? Like, if I'm a developer at, you know, Google or Facebook or Amazon, I don't care what I deploy on. I write code. I care about what's in the application, right? And like how it gets deployed is not my problem. And everyone else in the world right now cares about something like Kubernetes, or cares about, you know, Firecracker or whatever fun serverless thing I'm running on, because they have to. But in 10 years, they're not going to have to. And that's kind of, you know, beautiful in and of itself, and we'll have like the best operators ever at those companies. Anyways, my rant.
And I will add on to it, like Microsoft, like the first version of Microsoft Cloud Services, right? Whatever, 11 years ago, I don't know, something like that, right? It was all about PaaS, right? So platform as a service, truly push a button, or like, you know, tie it into your source control and deploy and forget about managing servers and whatever. And the ironic thing is that people didn't buy it. Like, people just didn't want it, because they were like, where's my networking? Where are my VMs? I want to touch my VMs. What are you talking about, right? And the super ironic thing is, like, we go in rounds, right? And we are now talking about, well, Kubernetes will let you deploy as a true PaaS once you configure it as a platform, and will let developers not care about operations. Like, okay, like, why is this going in circles? Right? Don't know.
Yeah, I mean, this one question pulled out the layers of the onion for sure. And I just want to say that I just want to take all these responses, and editors, marketing team, I want to be able to retweet all these because I do agree with the whole Kubernetes things and the NoSQL thing that got mentioned as well. And now there's actually SQL built in NoSQL, and everybody now, going back to Maya's point previously, where you mentioned developers bring on tools but don't have reasons for it. Having a different new NoSQL service that now you have to learn specifically how to query that one service, but not use SQL. Yeah, it's the sort of snake eating its tail. But speaking of snake eating its tail, let's move on to another question while we have time. And I guess a part of the questions that we sort of like went on rants and stuff like that when it came to DevSecOps. Folks are curious of what's next. What other sort of smash of something in the middle between DevOps are we going to be seeing? We saw the opposite, but yeah.
Data ops, for sure.
Data, excellent.
Yeah. So in other words, you know, if you think about it, you know, the sort of way that we work with and build applications has changed dramatically, right? Versus 5 years ago, let alone 10 or 20. It's just a completely different process today. And yet the way that we typically work with databases, up until pretty recently, looked pretty much the same. That sort of world just hadn't changed a lot. Now it's changing quickly because so many databases are moving to managed services, right? And you now have whole swaths of DBAs at organizations which are essentially deprecated overnight, right? You go all in on one of these managed services, and it's like, okay, all these things you used to do, backup, DR and all that's gone. But again, you sort of think about how applications are constructed, right? And the different groups. Well, when I was a developer, the only group that we had a harder time with in ops was the DBAs, right? And what we're seeing now is sort of a realization that whatever you want to do, whatever you want to build, odds are pretty good it's going to have data in there somewhere. Somebody knows how to work with it. Somebody has to know how to protect it. Somebody has to know how to, for example, give you test data, right? I need to sort of salt this so I can work on it. So to me, the next sort of big trend that we'll see, are data people, formerly sort of separate DBAs be integrated back into these teams, like one title. The financial regulatory agencies did this, and they call them all now. It's I don't know, data architects for DevOps or something like that, right? You know, that sort of old role went away, and now they're embedded directly in the teams. So anyway, I think that's what we'll see.
Excellent. Appreciate that answer too as well. I do want to ask one more question because we're pretty close to the end of the time. But there is a question that came in that I'm going to jump to the last question, which is I'm seeing more and more material online to do with GitOps. Is this another evolution of DevOps or more marketing that we're sort of seeing, or perhaps salary bands increasing?
I would say that GitOps the last one.
Feel like they,
you know, DevOps to get to ops, like that's where we're at now. I obviously am you know, biased. I work at GitHub. The trend for me is about moving everything else that you have into Git, into a change control system, right? It doesn't have to be specifically Git, but into change control. So if you're managing your code, fine, and now you're managing your infrastructure as code, and you're managing your policies as code, then there's nothing stopping you from also doing automated security scans of your policies and seeing if they meet the best practices. Nothing stopping you from looking at your Terraform template and seeing, oh, that firewall rule should be a bit different than what it was before. And so I think there's a trend towards, if you have everything as code, you can do a bunch of things with that code that you couldn't do before. And you can manage changes to your infrastructure and verify them and review them and have all these processes, this just change management process that you didn't have before. I don't think it's parallel to DevOps, if that makes any sense. It doesn't compare. It's like a different dimension of just how you manage things in your environment.
I think so. I super don't like the term, and I think Red Hat has some, you know, marketing materials there on GitOps too. So it's just me, Sasha, mostly. But I think it's a little bit of an anti-pattern, and so it's surprising to me that we are going towards GitOps as opposed to away from it, right? And the anti-pattern is that in GitOps you manage everything through branches, right? And so you go back to that long-living development branch and long-living staging branch and long-living production branch, and that's something that we've been trying to move away from, because the idea of CI/CD is that you publish to one master and then main, you go to main, and then you kind of move the same bits through all the systems, and you test the same bits on all the systems, right? And so the reason I don't like GitOps is we're kind of taking a step back from that now.
I mean, I might jump in. Since I don't work at GitHub and I don't have any financial bias here, like I actually like it. I mean, Sasha, I hear what you're saying. And I actually agree that maybe it's not the best thing to be using a conventional branching strategy, but the idea with GitOps in my mind is more, I think the spirit of what Maya was getting at is that we want a change log, and we want a programmatically accessible source of truth that's actually potentially coupled to the code itself. I think I would go back to, since we were talking about SLOs, this is definitely not possible right now, but for most organizations, but I think being able to have your SLOs actually checked in as code in the same place that you check in your configuration could be really, really powerful. I mean, observability was meant to be this like cousin of controllability and control theory in the 60s. And the reason we haven't gotten to controllability yet, frankly, because observability is still getting there. But once it's good enough and we can actually close the loop in an automated fashion, you could say, listen, like this is how good my service is supposed to be doing on a performance basis. It's part of my code. It's something I can change as part of a config push or whatever. And then your real system out in production could be responding to those new targets. But that does require that it's I think in the same repo as everything else. And when we don't do GitOps, I worry that the source of truth is getting distributed, which really concerns me. So that's what's always appealed to me about the concept.
Excellent. Hey, this was a great conversation. We're at time, so I do want to close the session out with sort of how people can find us, find the work that we're doing. Perhaps there's some talks or books we wrote that you want to share, just shout outs. But also, as we're sort of closing out, could you also share one takeaway for what's next for DevOps, which is the title of this session. So we'll go in reverse order. Stephen, do you want to go first, close us out?
Sure. Yeah. So like I said, I think the biggest thing to me to look for DevOps is what I mentioned before. And there's a piece, I think if you Google developer experience gap, I think you'll find it. I think that's certainly what I'm looking at sort of most for the calendar year ahead. Okay, excellent. And how can folks find your work? Oh, sorry, redmonk.com. On Twitter, SOGRADY, SOGRADY. I'm pretty easy to find. Excellent. And then Ben, do you want to let us know what's next for DevOps?
Sure. I mean, I guess I'm always focused on this part of the elephant and the whole blind man and the elephant analogy, but I always think about observability, and I alluded to it earlier, but I think we're getting really close to using observability to help bridge the communication gap between teams, and I think that's personally really exciting. Lightstep obviously is well aligned to that mission, and if you want to check out what we're doing, you should. If you want to find me, I'm on Twitter. My DMs are open. I love hearing from people. It's probably the best place.
Excellent. And then let's go with Sasha. Oops, Sasha, I think you muted.
I know. You can find me on sasharosamo.com, and it has a link to Notice, which has some of my talks, so you can watch them if you want. The latest one I super feel strongly about is growth mindset. I think we all need a little bit of that, and I've been, thinking about that talk for a long time, so I'm happy I finally did it. You can also find me on Twitter as DivineOps for some hot takes and lots of cat videos. I think I did also write a book. It's hopelessly outdated by now, and I hope, Stephen, your book did better than mine. I don't know. But I think my takeaway is that, I'm biased, right? I am on a managed OpenShift team, and the idea is that it's a managed service. So it's like PaaS plus, right? We give you an SRE also that manages your stuff, so you don't have to manage your stuff. And honestly, it's the point that Maya made earlier, like, you don't want to worry about the platform. If you're a developer, you want to worry about delivering value to your customers, to your users, and not managing, container orchestrators.
Excellent. And then finally, Maya, do you want us let us know how we can find your work?
Sure. If you can spell my name, you can find me on Twitter, and you can find me on Google. I have a website with my talks, and I think my kind of takeaway for DevOps, or my next step for DevOps, is I think you just write some tests, do yourself a service for the future, and write some tests for your service. It'll be easier to deploy anything and everything, including security patches. Everything that's old is new again, like patching. Yeah.
Excellent. Yeah. And then finally, me, I'm BDougie on GitHub, BDougieO on Twitter. And what's next for DevOps is that this video will be on GitHub's YouTube account, probably. So youtube.com/GitHub. Shout out there. And I'm just going to shout out myself, where I've been doing a daily GitHub action video on Twitter. So if you find me on Twitter, you'll see pinned to my profile. I've got a new automation script through GitHub Actions. I will be expanding through security and some other realms too as well. But right now, this week was all focused on automation on my workflow. So shout out to me. And thanks for stopping by, folks. Definitely continue to stay subscribed and like and ring the bell and all that other stuff. So enjoy the rest of your day.